The simple fact of the matter is, there is no free will debate. There are no determinists. There are people who claim to believe in determinism, but they betray themselves the instant they engage in an argument with someone about free will. By attempting to persuade someone to believe in determinism, they prove that they don't believe in it themselves. It only makes sense to debate the issue with someone if you assume that the person is free to change their mind on the matter. Knowing this, I usually don't waste much time with people who claim to be determinist. I just point out to them that they believe in free will too. If they press me to try to prove free will to them, I ask them if they're free to accept a good argument if I give them one, or if they're determined to reject any logical proof I might offer. If they are free to accept a good argument from me, then what need is there for me to give them one? They already believe in free will. And if they're determined to reject any logical proof, then why should I waste my time giving them one? Only about 12% of professional academic philosophers agree with the hard determinist view. And the truth isn't decided by majority vote, but this should give you some idea of how unconvincing the arguments for hard determinism are to professional philosophers. This means that 88% of philosophers accept that free will exists. Most of them are compatibilist, but even the libertarians outnumber the hard determinists. The fact that the majority of academic philosophers, around 60%, adopt the compatibilist position clearly shows that there is really no conflict between free will and determinism. As I see it, the whole idea of free will versus determinism is a false dichotomy. Technically, the opposite of determinism isn't free will, but indeterminism. It's a question of randomness versus non-randomness. So because free will is presented as if it were the opposite of determinism, sometimes people seem to confuse it with indeterminism or randomness. Determinists sometimes try to argue that even though you may have chosen a particular action, there was a reason why you chose that action, and that therefore that action wasn't free. This is a silly argument. It implies that acting with free will means acting completely randomly. But of course, acting with free will is not acting randomly. It's acting with intention. In fact, if our actions were completely random, that would be a stronger argument against free will. But we don't act randomly. We act intentionally. That is to say, our actions are determined by our will. It seems to me that's what we mean by free will. We aren't saying that our actions are random. We're saying that our actions are determined, but our actions are determined by our will. Here the objection often comes up that we may act according to will, but that there's a reason why we will to act in a certain way. So what? Why would we think that free will means acting without reason? According to the determinist, free will means doing something random for no reason whatsoever. But it seems to me that for an act to be truly intentional, there must be a reason behind it. To act according to will is to act with the intention to produce a desired effect. The reason I acted in one way rather than another was because I willed to produce one effect rather than another. I think the cause of the confusion is that we use the word reason in two different ways. The reason a pool ball lands in the corner pocket is because it was struck by the cue ball with a certain amount of force at a particular angle. For the pool ball, it was a purely mechanical and physical action. The ball lacked any kind of will. When we say there was a reason why the pool ball rolled across the pool table and landed in the corner pocket, We're talking about a purely mechanical and physical action, which is unaccompanied by any state of conscious intention on the part of the ball. But when the pool player struck the cue ball with the pool cue at a certain angle with a certain amount of force, his action was obviously related to will. The reason for his action was that he willed to make the shot. This is a simple and obvious fact. So what a determinist will try to do here is try to create an infinite regress argument. He'll say that yes, the pool player willed to make the shot, and that's the reason for his action, but there was some other reason why he willed to make the shot. Again, so what? He took that shot because he thought that it was the most advantageous shot for him to take. The determinist may say, aha, you see? Given that the balls were arranged on the table as they were, and given that he wanted to win, he could only have chosen to take that shot. Of course, the current arrangement of the balls on the table are the result of previous choices made by both players, and both players chose to play pool rather than do something else. But the determinist will keep trying to go backwards into an infinite regress by asking why they chose to play pool. He hopes to show that something caused them to want to play pool. And obviously, if you go far enough into the past, you get to a time before they were born. And obviously they didn't choose to be born, therefore they have no free will according to the determinist. Okay, so for the sake of the argument, let's say that God exists, and that God is eternal. God never chose to exist, presumably. He just always existed. So does the fact that God never chose to begin existing mean God lacks free will? That seems like a pretty absurd argument. Another form of the infinite regress argument is that even if your will is the reason for your actions, you can't choose to will differently, and therefore you lack free will, according to the determinist. This is absurd too. This argument would also lead us to conclude that God lacks free will. If God exists, and if God is eternal and uncaused, then his will is eternal and is a part of his divine nature. So the determinist will say that because God's will is determined by his nature, and his nature is eternal and unchanging, God isn't free to choose to have a different will from the will he has, and therefore God doesn't have free will. So according to a determinist, in order to have free will, you would have to have chosen to exist. Your will itself would have to be the product of your own will, which would also have to be a product of your own will, which would also have to be a product of your own will, and so on back into an infinite regress. And you would have to have chosen to exist, and to have one will rather than another. And you would have to have chosen to do so totally randomly and for no reason whatsoever. And obviously, no one who talks about free will is suggesting anything so absurd. It's a total straw man. It's the equivalent of being challenged to draw a square circle and then being told that unless you can draw a square circle, there's no such thing as a square. And this gets us into the definition game. Determinists will often challenge you to give them an absolutely clear and perfect definition of free will, and a full and detailed scientific explanation of it. And a lot of philosophers have devoted a lot of time trying to come up with a philosophically precise definition. Of course, you can look up the dictionary definitions for yourself. And if you're really good at deconstructing language, you can find something to object to in any definition of any word. So no matter what definition you give, they'll break down every word within the definition and ask you to define each of those words. They're going to try to make you define every word in the definition of every word in the definition of free will. They're trying to make it seem as if you can't even define free will. And if you can't even give an exact definition, then they'll say that it must not exist if you don't even know what it is. But you can do that with almost any word. To demonstrate the fallacy to them, I like to turn it around and challenge them to define matter. Most determinists are materialist. So I like to challenge them to define matter and to prove that matter exists. Of course, they can never satisfy the challenge as long as I hold them to the same impossible standards they're trying to hold me to. And of course, if they can't define matter or prove that matter exists, it's meaningless to talk about laws governing matter. So physical determinism goes right out the window. If they define matter as that which has mass and volume, I'll point out that mass and volume are measurements, and then ask them what it is that's being measured. And if they define it as something that can be experienced through the senses, then of course I'll talk about the matrix. No scientific definition of matter actually defines matter. If they say that matter is energy, I'll ask them to define energy. If they go into the realm of quantum physics, I'll just push them deeper and deeper until they can't answer me. That's exactly what they try to do in a discussion about free will. If free will is defined as an action freely chosen, they'll try to attack the definition of freely. They might even go as far as to say that unless you can violate the laws of nature, you don't have free will because your choices are limited. If I choose to open the door to go outside, they'll say I had no choice but to open the door, since I don't have the ability to walk through walls. If the definition of free will involves conscious choice, they'll bring up the idea that at least some decisions are made at a subconscious level. And that's fine. But your unconscious mind is still you. And even if you aren't fully aware of all of your subconscious motivations, that doesn't mean the action isn't caused by the will. At best, it simply proves that you are more than just your conscious mind, and that your will isn't identical with your conscious mind. So what? Why is there any contradiction between acknowledging that we have a subconscious mind and acknowledging that we have free will? How does the existence of the subconscious mind disprove free will? If a pool ball had a subconscious mind and acted out of subconscious mental states of intention, which it had no conscious awareness of, I would be willing to admit that the pool ball had free will, but not consciousness. But of course it doesn't have either. The pool ball has no mental states, either conscious or unconscious. It doesn't act, it is acted upon by purely physical, mechanical forces. And this, I think, gets to the heart of the determinist determination to deny free will. Anything mental makes them deeply uncomfortable. They want a purely mechanistic, materialistic universe. They can't explain consciousness. Yet they're conscious of their own consciousness. And even if they could succeed in explaining consciousness in purely material terms, it would seem difficult to explain its existence if there's no free will. Unless consciousness can affect the body, what would be the evolutionary advantage offered by consciousness? If conscious intention does not affect physical actions, then why would natural selection have favored organisms which developed primitive consciousness, which evolved over time into higher levels of consciousness? This would only make sense if conscious beings have free will. If all of our actions are determined by physical processes in the brain, and if decisions and choices are made unconsciously, and without conscious awareness, then what evolutionary purpose could consciousness and subjectivity possibly serve? Think of a computer program that can play chess. It can process information and react to that information without any consciousness. It may even be able to beat a skilled human opponent. No subjective experience is necessary, so why should it evolve? I've still never heard a good explanation for this that doesn't support free will. And of course, there's the even tougher question of how consciousness or subjectivity could somehow emerge through the interaction of material particles. How could physical processes ever result in mental experience? But even if you ignore that mystery, you're still left with the mystery of what evolutionary advantage consciousness offers if there's no free will. So ultimately, they have to try to deny consciousness too. They try to play the definition game. And consciousness is hard to define and explain, but we can't deny it. We're conscious of the fact that we're conscious. Some people absurdly claim that consciousness is an illusion. Think about that for a second. Imagine that you go to see a stage magic show. You watch the magician perform a series of amazing illusions. You have no idea how he did it, but you know it was all just an illusion. But the one thing that can't possibly be an illusion is the audience. If there's no audience, who is it that's witnessing the illusions? The rest of the audience might be an illusion, but you can't possibly be. If there's no one to experience the illusion, there's no illusion. Consciousness is the one thing that absolutely cannot be an illusion. Because without consciousness, there could be no illusion of consciousness. And if free will is an illusion, then why is there consciousness? Without free will, there's no reason for consciousness to have evolved. Why have a ghost in the machine if the ghost doesn't operate the machine or have any power to affect the machine's action in any way? If a car drives itself and has no manual override, why should there be a person inside? Of course, in this example, an obvious answer presents itself. The person serves no purpose whatsoever in relation to the car. The person wasn't created for the car. The car was created for the person. The car serves a purpose in relation to the person. Maybe the situation would be less confusing to us if instead of asking why and how cars produced people, we tried asking why and how people produced cars. Similarly, if you walked into a movie theater, you might wonder what the purpose of the audience is, since they don't seem to be able to affect the movie. It suddenly makes sense when you understand that the movie on the screen isn't real. It's an elaborate hoax. It's an illusion created for the audience to experience. Maybe consciousness produced the material universe instead of the other way around. Which makes more sense? What makes no sense at all is trying to convince people who lack free will to believe that they have no free will. And if your beliefs are determined, then why should you have any confidence at all that your beliefs are true? How did you arrive at your deterministic beliefs? Did you choose to examine the arguments for and against free will, and then choose between the two for a reason? Was your choice the result of your intention to arrive at the truth? If determinism is true, then there is no reason to have any confidence in your belief that determinism is true, because your belief is not the result of an intelligent decision. Maybe a determinist will say that his belief in determinism was the result of an intelligent decision, but that he had no choice but to believe in determinism because of the evidence and arguments he was presented with. I say that's nonsensical, but even if I accept that, how will he explain the fact that most people don't seem to be convinced by the evidence and arguments that he found convincing? He can only say that their rejection of the evidence and arguments in favor of determinism was caused by some sort of unconscious bias that they had no control over, or something like that. But how can he deny that his acceptance of determinism was caused by similar psychological explanations rather than by the validity of the arguments? So we're right back where we started. How can he say that his beliefs are right and theirs are wrong? He simply believes what he believes, and isn't free to believe otherwise. He is in fact ignorant of why he has these beliefs. Ultimately, his belief in determinism is simply determined. In other words, he is simply determined to believe in determinism and to deny free will regardless of what the evidence or arguments presented are. So again, why should I bother to debate him? It only makes sense for the determinist to debate someone who believes in free will if the determinist believes in free will. Otherwise, he has no reason to think that his beliefs are true, or that the other person is free to change his beliefs. And if he believes in free will, then it makes no sense for him to argue against free will, unless he's just a troll. If you're not a troll, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and visit my website at illuminatuspythagoras.com and check out some of my other work.